Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my presentation about the reproducibility of molecular adsorption potential energy surfaces. So as my title suggests, I'm going to talk about the potential energy surfaces of molecules on substrates. And what you can see here is a mock-up potential energy surface with a molecule on top of it. And potential energy surfaces can tell us quite a lot of information about the system. For instance, if we find the minima, we find the way the molecule likes to sit on the substrate. Now, if there are multiple ways the molecule likes to sit on the substrate, so if there are multiple minima, we can find the barriers between them. And if we look at one minimum and calculate the derivatives of the potential energy surface, we can find the vibration frequencies. And even if we are not interested in any of these direct properties and wanted to calculate, say, the charge transfer, we still need the adsorption geometry, and that requires knowledge about the potential energy surface. And this raises the question of reproducibility. So can we reproduce potential energy surfaces with the approaches we have been and are still using? And surface scientists like to use density functional theory. And here I have to mention that the interactions between the molecule and the substrate often depend on van-der-Waals interactions. So in the beginning, people used LDA because it gives results that match experiments reasonably well. When van-der-Waals corrections became available, people used them in conjunction with GGAs like the PBE functional. And van-der-Waals corrections like the Grimme-Free correction and the Tkatchenko-Scheffler correction have seen a lot of use. And there are also a number of functionals like van-der-Waals df that already incorporate van-der-Waals interactions. And we are going to look at all these functionals and van-der-Waals corrections and try to reproduce the potential energy surface. And we are going to look at the qualitative features, but also at quantitative features such as the minima. And for this, we needed to find a benchmark system. And the system we came up with is the German molecule put on silver 111. So why did I call PTCDA the German molecule? Well, it's because Germans have been measuring it quite a lot. And for instance, they found this commensurate add layer, which you can see on your right hand side, which contains two adsorption geometries. And of course, we would like to find these two adsorption geometries. And there have also been a number of theoretical studies of that system. For instance, the adsorption height has been calculated quite extensively with a slew of different DFT functionals and van-der-Waals corrections. But to this day, and to my knowledge, the potential energy surface as a whole hasn't been looked at. And that's where we come in. So how do we calculate the potential energy surface? So first of all, we use VASP to calculate the adsorption energies with all our functionals and van-der-Waals corrections. Now for each functional and van-der-Waals correction combination, we do about 50 DFT calculations, where we put the molecule at different adsorption heights, different lateral positions, and different rotations around the z-axis. Once we've gathered the data, we feed it into a Gaussian process regression algorithm that then generates our potential energy surface. And in our case, this is a function of the energy in 4 coordinates. And on the right-hand side, you can see an example of such a potential energy surface. Now, with all the technical aspects covered, let us look at a couple of results, starting with PB and the number of van-der-Waals corrections. And these you can see on your left-hand side, where the z-axis indicates the adsorption energy. The right-hand side shows you a top-down view of these potential energy surfaces, and you can see, indicated by the white frame, the area of the primitive substrate unit cell, which is also the area you can see on the left-hand side. Now, these potential energy surfaces are 2D cross-sections of the whole potential energy surface, where the molecule lies like this, and this is also the same orientation it has in one of the experimental adsorption geometries. The molecule also sits at its preferred adsorption height. Now, the reference point for the molecule on the potential energy surface is the molecule's center of mass. So if we put this onto a blue spot, the molecule sits in an energetically favorable position. And if we put the center of mass onto a red part of the potential energy surface, the molecule obviously doesn't want to adsorb there. Now, the first thing I would like to point your attention to is the qualitative agreement between these potential energy surfaces. So the blue parts and the red parts, so the energetically favorable and unfavorable bits, lie at about the same positions. And the same remains true if we compare PB with PW91, with RevPB, and also with LDA and van-der-Waals df. But you have no doubt noticed that besides this relatively rough qualitative agreement, there is quite a significant disagreement when it comes to the adsorption energy, and somewhat less noticeable, there is also a disagreement when it comes to the corrugation. So let's take a closer look at the corrugation, and we will stick with the example of PBE, where we can now see TSURF van-der-Waals correction highlighted, and we find a corrugation of about 300 millielectron volts. Now if we go to T3, we find that the corrugation has decreased a little bit. And if we go to TS, the trend continues. And if we go to PB without van der Waals correction, the trend continues further. Now the reason for this becomes clear if we plot the corrugation over the adsorption height. And here you can see the corrugation on the x-axis and the adsorption height on the y-axis. And PBTS surf has the lowest adsorption height and the largest corrugation. And as the adsorption height goes up, the corrugation goes down. And now I should mention that PB is dashed because here the molecule lies at the uppermost boundary of our search space. So we can say that for PB without van der Waals correction, the molecule really doesn't want to adsorb on the substrate. Now the reason for this behavior of the corrugation is that the corrugation is mainly contributed by the functional, and the van der Waals correction, for lack of a better term, adjusts the adsorption height. With the corrugation covered, we can now look into the reproducibility of the experimentally proposed adsorption geometries. And this requires analyzing the minima of the potential energy surface. And we will do so using disconnectivity graphs. So what is a disconnectivity graph? So here I have an example of a mock-up potential energy surface. And the first thing to construct a disconnectivity graph is finding the minima. And next we connect these minima via the lowest barrier. So we first connect the two on the right-hand side. And now the blue line tells us the energy required to go from one minimum to the other one. We connect the third, and now we can take these minima and impose a minimum barrier height. And if we do this and filter our minima by this minimum barrier height, we find the ones that are stable. Now in our case, we set this minimum barrier height to 10 millielectron volts, and if we filter our minima now, we get a picture like this. So here you can see the disconnectivity graph for PBE with the TS surf van der Waals correction. And you can see that we have found 4 local minima. Why did I say 4? Well, the minima you can see in pairs are all mirror symmetric, so I counted them as 1 each. And if we compare these minima now with the experimentally proposed adsorption geometries, we find that the 2 minima lowest in energy match the experimentally proposed adsorption geometries. And if we now do the same thing for all the other functionals and van der Waals corrections, we can find a picture like this, where in the upper left corner you see the 2 experimentally proposed adsorption geometries. You can see all the functionals and all the van der Waals corrections that we've used. And you can see if there is a colored tile whether we found one of the 2 experimentally proposed adsorption geometries. Now the color also tells us the adsorption height. And the first thing I would like to point your attention to is that the GGAs without van der Waals correction were not able to find either of the 2 experimentally proposed adsorption geometries. And that's because the adsorption heights in these cases are at the uppermost boundary of our search space. So we can say that here the molecule actually does not want to adsorb on the substrate. On the other hand, the TS surf correction yielded both experimentally proposed adsorption geometries when it was used with the PW91 functional and also with the PBE functional. PB plus T3 also did quite well, and van der Waals DF also found both experimentally proposed adsorption geometries, albeit at a somewhat high adsorption height. And all the other functionals and van der Waals corrections found at least one of the 2 experimentally proposed adsorption geometries. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation, giving you 2 take-home messages. First, as you can see from the example of the GGAs, describing van der Waals interactions correctly is vital. Otherwise, the results of your calculation might be completely erroneous. And second, all of these potential energy surfaces have multiple minima, and not all of them agree with the experiment. So if we just put a molecule on the substrate and hit the go button on your favorite geometry optimization code, you might end up in the wrong local adsorption geometry. And then the results of your calculation might also be suspect. So you should really know your potential energy surfaces. And with this, I would like to thank my colleagues, acknowledge funding agencies and computational resources, and of course, I would like to thank you for your attention.